you. Thank you so much, Professor Schaefer, and everyone else who's welcomed me. I'm going to try to truncate a little bit of the talk, some of it, my introduction included, and I want to make sure we have time for questions. You've waited far too long, and the expectation is concerning me. So let me say thank you, and also, yes, I probably am a bit jet lagged. I can't keep track of the days. I think Friday I drove 200 miles, then I flew from Phoenix, Arizona to Washington, D.C. Then I got about 5 hours of sleep, and then I moved some boxes to our house, and then I flew to Germany on a red eye. So it appears in my haze. I changed the name of the talk, and also, who knows what else will happen, but you'll be here to see it first. Okay, this is really an honor for me, and thank you very much. I look forward to learning from all of you. I'm already finding a lot of interesting connections with the people that I've met so far. And I may cut some things, so if things are confusing to you, I want you to feel free to ask me questions. Before I get to the main topic, which Professor Schaefer introduced so well, the Dillingham Commission, the largest study of immigrants ever conducted in the United States from 1907 to 1911, I feel that I must address the current situation in the United States and, of course, in Europe. If you follow the news in the United States, you know that immigration, refugee, asylum, and border policy are currently in disarray. This might sound familiar to you, and some would argue in crisis. I think that's debatable, and that's another thing. Well, some aspects of those programs are in more crisis than others, let's put it that way. Just last Wednesday, President Joe Biden's new policy to limit asylum seekers at the border went into effect. I've been living 8 miles from the US-Mexico border for the last 5 months, and there, just to give an example, I've kept an office in an artist co-op in this small town where I'm living, and the director needed to go to Mexico to get some dental work, and she was not sure if she would be back in time because the border could close at any time based on Biden's border policy. While I was living there, 1/3 of the boys on my 9-year-old's baseball team live in Mexico. They cross the border every day to go to school and baseball practice. One day we had to start a game a half hour late because the solar storms a few weeks ago shut down the computer system at the border, and the children were backed up. So I can't emphasize enough how tied the US and Mexico, now our largest trading partner, are. You see pictures of the wall, but that is actually very misleading. So I'm happy to talk about those things because they do relate in funny and almost paradoxical ways to what I'm going to be talking about today, which is largely about policy pertaining to Europeans in the early 20th century, but also had some perverse, and I mean that quite truly, perverse effects on Mexican and Asian immigration. Let me also add that 2024, this year, is the 100th anniversary of the Immigration Act of 1924, which was mentioned briefly in my introduction, also known as the Johnson-Reed Act, arguably the most important immigration law in US history. Luckily, no one forces us to rank them, but, and as mentioned, created a racist quota system that became the basis of the US's modern immigration system. There's a great deal of attention to the 1924 centennial law this year, actually, in the United States. I've already served on a symposium at the Center for Jewish History in early May that was looking back at the legacy of the 1924 law. There is also a fabulous article series in public books by leading historians and scholars, a series of articles, one by May Nye, actually printed and brought, probably the most important immigration scholar in the United States today. So there's been a great deal of attention to that centennial, and that's been very rich for the field of immigration history. It's also relevant to my book today, or to my talk today, because my book, Inventing the Immigration Problem, tries to explain the conditions that made the 1924 law possible. So now let me turn to my goals for this talk. I'll be speaking to you mostly about my second book, as mentioned. which looks at the inner workings of the so-called Dillingham Commission, which was convened as a government commission, a federal commission from 1907 to 1911. I'll also examine the impact of the commission's reports on how Americans and policymakers thought about immigrants and the federal policies they created. And I argue in that book that these policies carry a legacy even until today because, and this is the central argument that I make, they created the idea of immigration as a problem that only public policy could solve. So I mean problem in the social scientific sense, and that easily mutated into the idea of a problem more generally. Many of their ideas were shaped by European social science and the training in economics in Germany. Many of the leaders and writers of the reports had some of the first PhDs in the United States, and some of them actually got their PhDs in Germany. But before I tell that story, it's necessary to offer some historical context for the status of immigrants in the United States more generally. And I also want to offer some thoughts on the parallels and differences from the beginning of the last century to today. In other words, I hope my talk will help you to understand how the United States got from then to now, and what legacies remain in our immigration policy from what we might call its formative era in the years before 1924. So I'm going to begin with the story of Anna Herkner, and I mean, these slides better just be amazing. And already, oh goodness, I'm off to a good start, aren't I? That was just so on point, wasn't it? Let's go back. Yeah, there we go. There it is. There's the book. Oh dear, you fixed that. It takes a village. Okay.
Do we need it actually?
Yeah, I think it's for the
Okay. Oh, okay.
Okay, this is the classic sepia-colored picture of immigrants. I really fought hard against this cover, by the way, but that's the book. Okay, this is Anna Herkner, and I want to start with her story. Anna Herkner was from a family of Czech Bohemian immigrants in a small Bohemian enclave in the Midwestern town of Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Somehow she made her way to the University of California at Berkeley, graduating with a degree in Slavic literatures in 1904. After that, she went to work at a settlement house in a Polish neighborhood in Baltimore, Maryland. Settlement houses, for those who do not know, were centers of social reform, usually in poor or immigrant neighborhoods and run by young college-educated men and women. The most famous one, if you've had a basic US history, was Jane Addams' Hull House in Chicago. These young optimists, like Anna Herkner, promoted Americanization and progressive programs like clean government and social hygiene courses. She's a little unusual in that she came from an immigrant family, right? Not sort of waspy stock. Anyway, this picture of Anna Herkner is probably from 1907 or 1908, when she was employed by the Dillingham Commission, which I've just mentioned. She was one of around 300 employees of the federal study. These agents and aides eventually wrote the 41 volumes of reports previously mentioned. Some of the authors of these studies were women, actually, who had advanced degrees. Anna Herkner, who studied the conditions on transatlantic steamships, was one of those women who led a study. So to do her work, Anna Herkner and several of her staff, including men, dressed up as peasants and went essentially undercover and crossed in the transatlantic steamships that were transporting immigrants, right? The big business right here from Germany, right? Of transporting immigrants across the Atlantic to ports of entry like Ellis Island and Baltimore and so on. She described horrific journeys rife with disgusting, unhealthy conditions. She also witnessed and surely experienced rampant sexual harassment and assault. She reported stories that we would understand to be rape today. One young woman who was pregnant by the time that she was finished with the journey from a steward from the ship. And she reported these things as an undercover agent. By the way, I love this because it's very unusual that we should have a picture of one of the agents, and also because after her work with the Dillingham Commission, Anna Herkner went on to join the National Woman's Party and was among the many women who picketed outside Woodrow Wilson's White House for suffrage. So she's dear to my heart. So to return to our topic, with regard to immigration policy, let me offer some context for how things were different then and now. One of the biggest is this. There was basically no such thing as what some people today call illegal immigrants. So I've used Google Ngrams. How many of you have ever seen Google Ngrams? It's so much fun. It's actually very addictive. It's fun to think about digitized book data mining at Johannes Gutenberg University, right? Okay, so this is my putting in the term illegal immigrant in digitized books on Google from 1800 to 2000. And you can see that this term essentially does not exist until 1965. This is not a way that people talked about immigrants. What the more politically correct terms, right, are irregular, undocumented immigrants. Indeed, in the modern sense of this term, this category basically did not exist, except for Chinese immigrants, almost all of whom had been banned by the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Besides the limits on Chinese immigrants in 1882 and the related ban on Japanese laborers in 1907, there were almost no numerical limits on immigrants in the United States before arguably 1917. Numerical, nothing quantitative. Relevantly, there were growing numbers of restrictions based on physical and mental health, which give us insight into how American policymakers thought about what an undesirable immigrant was. In other words, long before there were numerical restrictions on immigrants, Congress passed a series of laws about health, which spurred fears of an immigrant menace or disease. The first federal immigration law banned idiots and lunatics, for example, which were technical terms related to intelligence. My undergraduates always are amused by that. Morons, idiots, and lunatics were excluded. The recent pandemic reminded us, in fact, that the roots of modern immigration exclusion laws were actually the quarantine laws of early America, many of which were based on English common law and were often local. Some of these, I'm so afraid. So here is an example of a health inspection at Ellis Island. Ellis Island, by the way, somehow I didn't manage to actually put it in the written part of talk, but I always like to mention this. How many of you have heard of Ellis Island? How many of you have been there? So this is the very famous federal arrival port for immigrants. But what's really amazing about Ellis Island is that it is actually a national monument to federal immigration policy because it was only built in 1892. Before that, there were no federal ports of entry in the United States. They were state ports of entry. So it is itself a physical monument to the history, the relatively recent history of federal immigration policy in the United States. In any case, some of these restrictions against immigrants we now understood are cruel or even ridiculous. This person is being inspected for lice, and I can tell you easily half of my younger son's elementary school would not pass this test, I think, at any given time. But something like 97% of arrivals at Ellis Island passed the inspection. So it was harrowing and frightening to go through this process, but the vast majority of people passed these health inspections. They were not particularly meant to exclude. In fact, there's a family story of my husband's grandfather, who was an Eastern European Jewish immigrant, Julius Cohen, immigrating as a child, and being sick and being in hospital at Ellis Island, and then getting out and being able to stay in the United States. I've not been able to verify that story, but it is a very plausible story. So this is the era before quantitative restrictions, and the restrictions that did exist were what we would call qualitative. They were based on the quality of a person or their condition, but they were not actually meant to exclude large numbers of people. That was not their intent. So more restrictions, of course, were coming. Let me summarize. Here are some of the big differences between then and now. Until a few decades into the 20th century, as I mentioned, there was basically no such thing as an illegal alien. The Border Patrol is also having its 100th anniversary this year. The Border Patrol in the United States was not founded until 1924. Now, I want to put this into perspective. The older I get, the less impressive this is for undergraduates. I used to think it was impressive, but now I'm 51 and I'm an old. But my own grandmother was already a young married woman by the time the Border Patrol was passed. That's on my father's side. My maternal grandfather was born in a border town in Arizona 11 years before the Border Patrol existed, in an area that is now absolutely ubiquitous with the Border Patrol and has a wall. At that time, when my grandfather was born in 1914, Mexicans were a very small part of the overall migration flow to the United States. But their numbers were beginning to tick upwards after the Mexican Revolution began in 1910. And I can't remember if I have a slide on this because I'm jet lagged, but it is in fact, Mexican immigrants were so unusual in the United States, and almost all of them went to the American Southwest. They're not even listed on the printed forms that the Dillingham Commission created to interview immigrants. Okay, so my first book and my current project in some ways concern the Arizona-Mexico border, so you can feel free to ask about it. But this book, Inventing the Immigration Problem, as I mentioned, involves the Dillingham Commission, which has been mostly associated with the study of Eastern and Southern Europeans. Most sociologists, political scientists, and historians have studied the commission with regard to the attention that it paid to so-called new immigrants, Eastern and Southern European migrants. From 1907 to 1910, the commission and its staff visited or gathered data on all 46 states, there were 46 states then, and several territories, including Hawaii. Bit of a boondoggle. Senator Dillingham thought it was necessary to go to Hawaii to check out immigration conditions. Me too. Anyway, it had 9 appointed members, 3 senators, 3 congressmen, and 3 experts appointed by Theodore Roosevelt. You can see it's a really diverse group, really representative of the United States at the time. Actually, what's interesting is that Jewish lobbyists tried to get a Jew appointed to the commission and were shot down. Italians tried somewhat to try to get an Italian, less so, but they were told by the Roosevelt administration that immigrants couldn't be objective about it. Immigrants. So these guys, of course, could be super objective. All right, anyway. I mean, it's hard to take these people seriously, but they took themselves very seriously. Anyway, the commission is really quite extraordinary because the legislation was wide open. The legislation said they had no limit on the time or on the expense that they could incur, every government official's dream. And they spent nearly $1 million, which was a lot of money in 1911. In their 4 years of work, a staff of more than 300 compiled the 41 volumes. We've told you how many volumes there are, way too many times. And a potent set of recommendations that shaped immigration policy for generations to come. As I mentioned, I chose Anna Herkner in part because I wanted to emphasize that over half of the commission's employees were women, many of whom had college degrees and in fact advanced degrees. In some cases there was a medical doctor, there were several PhDs, and many with master's degrees. The final reports totaled 29,000 pages. The breadth of their topics and the geography that they covered boggles the mind and tells us a great deal about the priorities of the progressive era mind. Fully half of the reports, 20 of them, focused on immigrants in American industries, of course, at the time of American industrialization. These were thick with numbing and undigested tabulations. They did not know sampling method yet, so the idea was to just mass as much data together as you could. Reports considered everything from the head size of new immigrants, Franz Boas's study, to Anna Herkner's report, to studies of prostitution, also involving undercover work. debt peonage, crime, schools, agriculture, philanthropies, other countries' immigration laws, and immigrant women's fecundity or their, so this was a kind of biopolitics, right, of concern about the birth rate of immigrants. Reformers in the progressive era advocated and often deployed federal policies of surveillance, regulation, interstate policing, and broad powers of deportation to empower the government's ability to exclude immigrants. All of these actions sound, even if we're critics of them today, very normal. But what I want to argue is that these were quite new, and all of these actions contributed to the growth of federal power in the United States. So how does this matter to today? First off, of course, in many ways, the United States, and increasingly, I think, the EU, is living in an era similar to the early 20th century. 1907 was smack dab in the middle of the era of massive immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe to the United States. At this time, these people were known as new immigrants to distinguish them from old immigrants from countries like, and predominantly, Germany and Ireland in the mid-19th century, right? So the Dillingham Commission used as its taxonomy for understanding immigrants the category old immigrants to describe the Western and Northern Europeans who came between 1830 and 1860, and the term new immigrants to describe the approximately, eventually, 24 million new immigrants who came between 1881 and 1924, who eventually reached almost 15% of the population in the United States. So this was the peak. I'll show you a slide in a second. The early 20th century represented the highest percentage of the US population to be foreign-born in American history, almost 15%. And if you talk to someone like me, who is the descendant, at least in part, of Eastern European Jews or Italians in the United States, it is almost certainly the case, if they're my age, that they are third generation, because the quotas cut off that immigration in 1924, which means that those generations are very clearly delineated for Eastern and Southern Europeans. So in that sense, it was an era very similar to today. I think this slide appears in more, there it is, beautiful. Had it not been for the 2008 economic crisis, it's quite likely that the percentage of immigrants in the United States would have exceeded in the early 21st century, give me a sec. You see what I'm saying. Let's say 2010 would have exceeded 1910 had it not been for that economic crisis. These numbers, which include undocumented immigrants, best estimates suggest that's not the case, but you can certainly see the parallels. Now, a major way that that era differed from today, though, is that in the so-called progressive era, a growing number of Americans viewed government policy and social reform with optimism and enthusiasm, not cynicism and disdain, a view that we actually find quite quaint in the United States in 2024. They look to the brand new disciplines of social sciences, economics in particular, and like I said, heavily influenced by European social reformers. They believed that social policy could provide them the solution to social problems, and that progressive policy ideas could legislate their way out of what they saw as a problem of immigration. So let me say a bit about the recommendations that the Dillingham Commission made. Now, you have to understand that my full-time residence is Washington, D.C., where my audience is always shocked, delighted, and taken aback to learn that the Dillingham Commission's recommendations, almost every single one was actually instituted. This is extraordinary for a federal commission. Federal commissions, including this one, are usually created to punt, right? When the parties can't agree on a policy problem, they say, let's have this bipartisan commission study it and we'll get back to you, and then it gets shelved. That's not what happened with the Dillingham Commission. It took about a decade, but actually almost all of its recommendations were eventually implemented. The commission's chief recommendation was for a literacy test for immigrants, a continued ban on Asian immigrants. Although I'm going to say as a side note, because this commission is often characterized as very extreme. The commission recommended the continuation of the existing Asian exclusions, but did not suggest they make it permanent. They were actually, in retrospect, kind of moderates on the Asian exclusion question by the early 20th century standards. They recommended additional regulations, a higher head tax, which was meant to both fund the Immigration Bureau and deter poor immigrants. But most importantly, they recommended, it was the first official recommendation of some kind of numerical limit on immigration, an actual quantitative limit. The form that they suggested was a bit different than what actually happened, but that final recommendation became, by the 1920s, the national origins quota system that openly discriminated against Southern and Eastern Europeans. It did so by using a formula that created national quotas based on, this is, okay, very hard to explain, based on the proportions of immigrants in the 1890 census. In shorthand, what does that mean? 1890 was very early in the period of influx from Southern and Eastern Europe. That meant that if you based a formula of quotas on that census's proportions of immigrants, the proportions from Southern and Eastern Europe would be very small. I could get really into the details, but honestly, do you care? No. So that's the takeaway. If you do, you can ask me later. Okay. That meant that effectively, after 1924, it was almost impossible for people from Italy and Eastern Europe and Southern Europe to come to the United States. Now, these recommendations, even as suggestions, and especially once they were enacted, signaled a watershed change. I mean, this is the argument of my book, but I cannot emphasize enough what a significant change this was in American immigration history, because it represented the first time that immigration policy was based on quantitative rather than qualitative measures like race, criminal status, disease, radical politics, or to use the language of the policymakers themselves, this was the first time that an immigration policy was designed to be restrictive rather than regulatory. It was to restrict the amount of immigrants, not to filter what kind of immigrants, which had been the previous method. So in my book, I argue that the climate that made these restrictions possible required an equation that went like this. This is historian math. The Dillingham Commission report plus the Red Scare, right, the backlash against immigrant radicals during and after World War I, plus the rise of eugenics in the United States led to the immigration restriction of 1921 and 24. So a side note that I don't develop here, but I'm happy to take questions on, is one of the important sub-arguments that I make in my book. That's sort of the argument I'm making with other scholars about the Dillingham Commission, is that I argue that eugenics were not nearly as developed during that 1907 to 1911 period as other scholars have said. In fact, there were right-wing critics of the Dillingham Commission that felt that they had based their arguments too much on economics and not on race science. In fact, also, many of the kind of canonical eugenics texts, some of which influenced Nazi, racial laws in the 1930s, had not actually been published yet or were not yet popular in the United States. I'm very proud to say that the historian May Nye, one of my heroes, in her recent piece on the 1924 law, I'm in a footnote on making this point, so I guess she agrees, so I say it must be right. Okay, now, fast forward 40 years. In the years after World War II and after the horrors of the Holocaust, these laws, the 1924 laws, were increasingly an embarrassment to policymakers in the United States. First, President Harry S. Truman, he actually created 2 commissions that tried to change immigration laws, was unsuccessful. Then President JFK, then whose own Irish immigrant and Catholic origins influenced his feelings about wanting to enact immigration reform. And finally, Lyndon Baines Johnson took up the cause of trying to get rid of the discriminatory quotas. The famous Hart-Celler Act, or Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, was the law that changed the discriminatory nature of the quotas. It has long been considered part of the set of civil rights laws that Kennedy and Johnson passed. The Hart-Celler Act was the long-fought victory of those who had long tried to get rid of the national origins quotas. In fact, Representative Celler was a Jew himself who was one of the few people who voted against the 1924 Act. As an elderly man, he was still in Congress in 1965 and got to be one of the named sponsors of the 1965 Act. Now, I say that it got rid of the discriminatory aspects of the quota, but the Hart-Celler Act did not get rid of quotas, and in fact, given the nature and prominence of that reform, it is notable that it too was a quota system. What it did was make the quota for every country the same. Now, it appears that this group has very good English skills, but even many Americans, I think, do not understand the difference between equality and equity. This is a perfect example of equality that is not equity. For Germany and Mexico and the Philippines to have the same quota to the United States is insane. It doesn't make any sense at all, and it basically necessitates undocumented immigration. It is not possible to share a 2,000-mile border with a country, for example, and expect it to only have the same amount of legal migrants each year as Serbia. Okay? That is insane. That was never going to work. It's not the focus of my topic today. Much has been written about that. Now I'm simplifying it because it also included family reunification. But the fact is that the Hart-Celler Act, for all of its civil rights ideals, also set up the perfect storm for the rise of undocumented immigration. Now, here's something to chew on. This is basically what I said before. Sorry, I'm going to backtrack just a minute because I want to emphasize one point here. Yeah, we're not doing too bad. Okay, I kind of already said these two. I just really, really want to emphasize this point, and I'm going to come to it in my conclusion. One of the things that I argue is that in the United States, there was still a great fear of federal power in the early 20th century. And so, I like to use this counterexample when I teach immigration history to my undergraduates. You probably know that there was tremendous discrimination against Irish immigrants to the United States. It is trotted out as an example of some of the worst nativism in US history. Yet no federal laws were passed to limit Irish immigration. If we think from today's point of view, that's actually rather shocking. But the reason isn't because most Americans liked the Irish better than the refugees that they're so opposed to now. It's because they feared federal power. They did not have the kind of imagination to think about a federal state powerful enough to do things like limit immigration on that scale. I'm arguing in part that the Dillingham Commission represents a moment in the progressive era where Americans were starting to feel pretty excited about federal power. That's a weird, wonky statement, but anyway, and I think that's really important. So I did actually want to just emphasize that one point. Okay, now here's an amazing thing about immigration policy from today's perspective and from someone who's just been living on the border. Before 1965, there was no quota at all on Mexico, obviously our largest immigration source. In 1924, the policymakers who passed the national origins quota laws were interested in curbing Asian immigration and Eastern Southern European immigration. They barely even noticed Mexican immigration, which was almost entirely, like I mentioned, in California, Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. Arizona and New Mexico weren't even states yet. No one thought about them. In fact, I love to trot out this statistic. I find it fascinating. The US government did not even bother to count land crossing immigrants from Mexico and Canada until 1908. And again, didn't create the Border Patrol till the year of the national origins quota. So one of the consequences you can see here, you can see how the impact of the Hart-Celler Act and other legislation shaped immigration flows to the United States. So we see Europe plummet, but this is almost entirely Eastern and Southern European immigration. And then we see a slow rise and then a really precipitous rise of North America, which of course is mostly Mexican immigration, though not entirely. Okay, now let me return to those quotas and limits. And I want to make sure we have time for questions. We're great, we're so good. Going back to that slide that I was just talking about, why should we find any of these suggestions or laws surprising? From today's standpoint, unless you're actually, the US is as divided as it has probably ever been, except for the Civil War. You're not just, that's not your perception. Yet, across almost the entire political spectrum, there is agreement that there is federal regulation of immigration. It is merely how one might do it, right? But I want to suggest, as I mentioned just now, that that's actually kind of a new perspective historically. To assume that the federal government had the power to regulate immigration at the scale of federal power needed to do so is a historical development and not a natural one. It's the job of the historian to say, really? Did we normalize something that actually had origins in a particular moment of time, the Progressive Era, and that once might have seemed strange? And that is really the central kind of intellectual and historical point that I want to make about the Dillingham Commission, is that, as I mentioned at the beginning, it was full of young, enthusiastic, first generation of social scientists who perceived immigration as a problem, that's why the commission was created, and developed tools to solve the problem. That is a particular way of looking at immigration that is historically and even discipline specific, and it has persisted since that time. Before the progressive era of the early 20th century, it was not clear to most people that either part of this supposition, that immigration was a problem, or even if it was, that it was the federal government's problem to solve, was true. People prior to this time talked about the immigration question. I know this is a common formula in Europe, the Jewish question, the woman question, right? There's lots of, it's a formula that we use. But restrictions, as I mentioned, to the United States were almost nil. Don't worry, it's really big font. I know you're seeing this giant sheaf of papers. If I were you, I would be thinking that. Okay. In the mid-19th century, immigrants were welcomed. German immigrants were almost uniformly welcomed, as were my Swiss ancestors who were part of that. I'm like a new immigrant, old immigrant mashup. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. It was a terrible law. It was a racist law. It was the first to restrict immigrants on the basis of class because it excluded laborers, but also race because it named China. And later iterations of that make that clear, that in fact, it counted the Chinese racially. So Chinese were restricted even if they came from another country. It was not based on nationality. It was in fact based on race. And then eventually, when China got a quota of 100, a symbolic quota, it could not be Chinese, people of the Chinese race. It was generally like English, Hong Kong. Anyway, I digress. But the point is, Chinese exclusion was a terrible law and a very important precedent in the United States. But it was also limited in that it specifically targeted one group, and it was not clear that that would be a precedent for other laws. In general, Americans were deeply skeptical about federal power in the 19th century, especially, just to situate you, in the years after Reconstruction, which many Americans felt was a horrible excess of federal power. They were skeptical. Southern lawmakers consistently voted against immigration exclusion laws until 1907 because they saw them for what they were, instruments of federal power. There were even members of Congress from the South who understood that Theodore Roosevelt's big stick, right, could be applied against them. If they gave him the federal power to regulate immigration, some of them actually said on the floor of Congress, then we know that he could try to fight Jim Crow too. So now I want to say a couple things about, now that I brought up Roosevelt and his big stick, and that he was, as you know, a proponent of federal power, that's a good segue to a point I want to make about the history of immigration policy in the United States from a political standpoint. It has generally been the case that Congress, which of course has the Senate, which is not particularly representative, and Congress, which is very representative, right, because it has 435 representatives who come from particular regions, right, they have districts. Congress has favored legislative approaches to immigration policy. They're the ones who make the laws, so it makes sense. While presidents have generally favored executive power to be flexible with immigration policies. So I'll give you some really obvious examples. Trump, right, having executive orders about Title 42, about limiting immigration during the pandemic. An even better example is President Obama and DACA, the deferred action on the children of immigrants, right, of children immigrants. That was not legislation, that was an executive action, okay? Members of Congress are parochial in the truest sense. They are answering to their district. They are much more likely to be populist. They are much more likely to think about immigration policy in domestic terms. What is its impact on, say, jobs or culture in my district, right? Whereas presidents want to be able to use immigration policy in a way that is diplomatically advantageous. This is why, historically, until Donald Trump's presidency in 2016, it has historically been true that presidents, regardless of party, have tended to be more centrist and flexible on immigration policy than Congress has. They have to answer to nation states and national leaders who might be sending countries, and they don't want to unnecessarily anger them. So note that George W. Bush, before 9/11, had an immigration policy reform agenda that looked quite similar to President Obama's. Of course, neither of those passed, but were actually more similar than different. Of course, Trump has completely changed those general rules about the executive branch versus the legislative branch, and with his recent order about asylum seekers, it appears, sadly, that President Biden is actually following in some of those footsteps. All right. Again, I just want to emphasize what an outlier President Trump was in this regard. Presidents from Lincoln, who under whom the only pro-immigration law was ever passed in the United States, Grover Cleveland, President Taft, President Wilson, Truman, JFK, Reagan, all spoke and acted in favor of immigration and immigrants. The literacy test, which I mentioned earlier, which was passed in 1917, passed Congress 5 times and was vetoed, twice by Wilson, also by Cleveland, also by Taft. See, Congress wants limits, presidents of both parties deeply skeptical. Okay, so one of the things that I mentioned is that I think that the Dillingham Commission had an impact on how people thought about immigration more generally and ever since. This is a 1-volume summary that 2 of the main leaders, report writers of the Dillingham Commission wrote. This was, rather than government reports, which no one's gonna read, this was actually published for the public and went into several editions, and you could buy it if you were a member of the public really interested in immigration policy. So this was a way that this work got disseminated to a broader audience. And they made these arguments about quotas and so forth. Okay, so I've actually already said these things. Let's summarize so you can get to questions. I talked about Mexico. You can create a quota, but it's not going to make a difference. Again, to underscore, to use the opportunity of my recent sabbatical to put this into perspective, I'm going to come back to that. This is actually the border wall 8 miles from where I was living. And this is my son's baseball team. This is only 4 nights ago. It's been a busy 4 days. This was his last game and we were moving away. So we wanted to have a little going away party after his baseball game. But some of the mamas and grandmas reminded me that the border crossing closes at 10. So we needed to make sure that the game, which had started late, wrapped up our pizza and cake party in time for 1/3 of the team to get back across the border in time. And I want you to think about the fact that it's the border with that wall. Its port of entry closes at 10. These kids cross every day. So there's this wall, but it's, in some ways it's theater. Now, admittedly, these kids are crossing legally, right? They're crossing at a port of entry, but I think you can see this sort of amazing contrast. I would argue that theater and power is not a direct product, it's been a minute, but is a legacy of this early 20th century policymaking. All right, now I want to go back to this. So I wanted to give you 3 quick examples. If you're already tired, it was 4, I've cut down, post-pandemic, we can only absorb so much. 3 points of today's US policy that I think reflect in some ways on what I've been talking about today. The first is the public charge rule, which is abbreviated by historians as the LPC, the likely to become a public charge rule. You may be excluded at the border if you are likely to become a public charge. I'm using the word border literally because I've just been living at a land border, but I also mean a port of entry at JFK International Airport or what have you. Okay, so if you're coming legally to the United States, since 1882, the federal government can exclude you if they think you are likely to become a public charge. What they mean by that is, will you become reliant on social welfare programs? Will you be able to support yourself? This tells you a great deal, my European audience, about the poverty of the social welfare state in the United States and the ways in which Americans tend to think of it as a very limited good, not a universal one. This law is deeply racialized, but also ableist, gendered, and heteronormative because border agents, inspectors could use a great deal of subjective interpretation to decide whether someone was likely to become a public charge. A single mother, almost certainly. How is she going to support her children? She's going to end up on welfare? No, right? This man looks effeminate. He'll never get a job. He's not sturdy and strong enough. No. And so on. Okay. Over the years, because this law has stayed in the books for so long, it has been morphed to be used in varieties of ways. During the pandemic, courts allowed President Trump to implement a rule that widened the categories of public assistance used by legal immigrants to make them subject to deportation as public charges. So he took folks that were already in the United States and said, you're LPC, you should be excluded. They also widened this category because it's an administrative rule, not a legislative rule. I'm throwing a lot of things at you. What I mean is that it's open to interpretation, and each presidential administration has been able to define it differently. Some of the results of Trump's ruling about likely to become a public charge making you subject to deportation is that during a pandemic, it made people terrified to get public health, to go to public health clinics, right? They didn't want to go to shelters. They didn't want to get immunization. They were trying to hide from officials. It keeps families from signing up for free or reduced meals in public schools. That's a very important way that we feed U.S. school children. is that children with reduced or low income receive free or reduced cost meals in public schools. And in some poor schools, all the kids eat free. So if you're afraid to sign up because you think it will show that you're poor and you're going to get deported, your children might go hungry. Another way, obviously, is in refugee law. In fact, here we have a bit of a difference from a century ago. In the United States, refugee law is separate from immigration law. So everything I've told you so far today, and good job staying awake in the dark with the long wait with the slides, everything I've told you today has been immigration law. The United States did not pass any refugee laws specifically addressing refugees till the Displaced Persons Act in 1948, and didn't have a comprehensive refugee act using the UN's HCR ideas until the Refugee Act of 1980. Now, in fairness, based on what you just saw about immigration law, in some ways the United States didn't need refugee laws before 1924 because the parameters were so broad for entry except for Asian exclusion. Many people who we might categorize as refugees today just came in as regular immigrants. The common example people give are Eastern European Jewish immigrants, right, who were escaping pogroms, for example. In fact, recent studies have shown probably a lot of those folks were economic migrants more than anything else. But that is a category of people that might try to come as refugees today if they were in a similar situation. So Soviet Jews in the 1980s, for example, came as refugees to the United States. What is significant and important about this is that refugee and asylum law fall under the executive branch, not the legislative branch in the United States. So returning to my point about federal power, and I know I'm throwing a lot at you. Each year, the President of the United States can determine it is an executive action, does not need a law from Congress to say how many refugees can come to the United States, right? So this is a tool of foreign policy and diplomacy, much more so than our so-called immigration laws, which have to go through Congress, right? So historically, as many of you know, the refugees who get into the United States, those folks who get to be refugees, tend to be from countries that the United States wants to keep happy, right? Or they want to make a point about. Cuban refugees. Why did we let so many Cubans in? To thumb nose at Fidel Castro, to try to say in the Cold War, we welcome people escaping from communism. There's many other examples I could give, but that's the similar story with Soviet Jews in the 1980s as well. Okay, the third point I want to make about federal power and issues today, and this is going back obviously several years under the Trump administration, but it is still happening. The practices of immigrant detention and child separation draw on some narrow patterns of immigration legal history, but only the most racist ones, Asian exclusion. What do I mean by that? So the history of family separation and child detention in the United States is actually in Asian exclusion more so than the other branches of immigration law. I have a student who finished a beautiful dissertation 2 years ago on the history of child immigration. And she found that, she and others have found that on Angel Island, which was a processing center for Asian immigrants, it was common for Asian children, for Japanese and Chinese children to be separated from their parents for very long periods of time, because Asian immigrants were often in detention for a very long time as their cases were adjudicated to see if they were eligible for the very narrow categories that would allow them to get in. But because there was very little exclusion of European and actually Latin American immigrants, there is not a long history of child detention and family separation in American immigration policy more generally. So if we were wanting to look at a legacy, a historical legacy for family separation in the United States, we would have to look at the very worst, most racist components of American immigration history. In other words, this is an example of a way in which immigration policy has become, I think it's fair to say, morally worse. It's actually worse than it was historically. There were no facilities to separate families on Ellis Island, right? Most people, if a child was found that they needed to return, then the whole family returned. It was very unusual to separate these families. All right, so I'm gonna wrap up now. All of these situations, I hardly need to tell you, cause trauma. So do hostile racist attacks in the public sphere and media. And while there are precedents, obviously, for anti-immigration language and vitriol in the historical past, I think we could argue that in many ways they are actually contextually worse today than they ever were before, certainly out of the mouth of a president and now presidential candidate. I say this with the knowledge that this is increasingly an international problem. It is actually a little chilling to talk about refugee policy and immigration policy on this day after the EU elections. In general, human beings struggle to integrate our memory of the past with how we think about our present realities. And something that has moved me ever since it, I think, was presented in 2016 is that the American Historical Association has named as one of the core tenets of historical practice empathy. And I really like to tell that to audiences that don't include historians, because you might not think of that, but we need to think about people in the past with empathy. To conclude, let me return to the point about the consequences of expanding federal power by way of immigration policy. It leads to things that are intellectually nonsensical, and my favorite example is this. You may recall Steve Bannon, President Trump's terrifying populist right-wing spokesperson. He's actually about to report to jail. I just heard that on the news. Yay! In 2017, he called for what he called a deconstruction of the administrative state, even as he advocated a dramatic expansion of federal immigration enforcement and exclusion. That makes no sense, okay, right? Those are logical, that's illogical. That's the best thing I could say about it. That's illogical. But conceiving of immigration as a problem in America was an invention, and it was deeply embedded in the way that both bureaucrats and elites saw the relationship between social science and public policy in the progressive era. Now, in the United States, recent politics have shown that Americans have long since left that confidence in experts and social science behind. But we still live with the residue of their misguided confidence. Thank you, and please ask me anything you want.
Well, thank you very much. So we have time for questions. Yeah, that's the first one. Read that.
And please introduce yourself. I mean, I met you, but still.
Hi, my name is Mita. I teach American Studies, and I was really, really sort of impressed by your talk on so many levels. So because I've been,
Thank you.
I've been obsessed with the racial prerequisite cases and the idea of whiteness.
Oh, like
And
FIND,
so-
VUS? Yeah.
Right. So then my question would be, in this immigrant problem, to what extent would not only whiteness, but also cultural compatibility play a role, right? Because the Asiatic barred zone, because I come from Asian American studies,
Yeah.
That would have been a huge sort of topic, both in the racial prerequisite
Yes.
cases, but
I'm
also
just
in
going to
other
take a couple notes.
questions about compatibility, right? And it's actually something that is being discussed in Germany too, right?
Of course.
Yes.
Okay. The first thing was about whiteness, and then the second used term I especially like, say cultural something?
Compatibility.
Yes, okay. I'm glad you asked that because I have some takes that are a little different than other folks. Okay, so the first thing that I want to say is that, all right, so I'm gonna answer three things. One about whiteness, one about cultural compatibility, and one about the comparison to Germany. Okay, so my first book really actually in some ways is a history of whiteness. And in that book, which is about this region, it's a copper mining region, and now I'm writing a history of the global history of that company. But that, because it was an industrial mining area, it had people from 36 countries. In fact, I learned about the Dillingham Commission because I read their report on copper mining and smelting in the Southwest, and I was very intrigued. And also, it was a wonderful introduction to the report because it was contrarian about, that particular report challenges some stereotypes that scholars have about the commission. I really am answering your question. One was that Mexicans had to be included in that report because there were a lot of them there. So it's a rare instance where they actually talk about Mexicans, though they're not particularly interested in them. Two is that although most scholars have written about the Dillingham Commission as racist, full stop, capital R, I just stopped in my tracks when I read their report about wages in copper mines and smelters. And they looked at wages of Mexicans, native-born Americans, Italians in particular. There's a lot of Italians there. There's a lot of Serbs there. There's actually a Serbian Orthodox church in this little town that I lived in, 8 miles from Mexico. And I'll never forget this line. The Dillingham Commission report said, "Only racial discrimination can explain the disparity in wages." Not bad. That's what I think too. That book was designed to use this one county as a study in the history of whiteness. Specifically, why did elite Blanco Spanish origin Mexicans end up as non-white in this region, and Slavs ended up as white, right? Because the whiteness literature in the United States is all about how Eastern Europeans had to become white, whatever. So I'm very much of the school that legally white makes a huge difference, right? And some of you may know, if you're American historians, the book White on Arrival by my colleague Tom Guglielmo, who teaches at George Washington University. I'm at Georgetown, commonly confused. And Tom makes the point that Italians faced lots of discrimination, but they were legally white, and that made a huge difference. And that's actually a point I make about Jews, and I saw that you're assigning the chapter on Jews in the seminar, about American Jews too, which is a much longer conversation, obviously. All of which is to say that there's a lot about whiteness going on here, and I would call myself in the whiteness scholar world a moderate. Does that make sense? Okay. Because I think legal whiteness counted for a great deal. For one thing, it meant you could naturalize.
Mexicans were legally white.
Correct. Yes, except for 1930 was the only time they weren't. And that was why I thought that case was interesting. Why did they end up on the non-white side even though they were legally white? But that's a topic for a different day. But cultural compatibility, really glad you asked that question. Here's why. I didn't mention it today, but one of the things that I thought was really fascinating about the Dillingham Commission, and is one of my arguments that they weren't as into eugenics as later scholars have said, is because one of their recommendations was for something called distribution. And the idea was, this already existed, but they wanted to massively expand the effort to get new immigrants, Southern and Eastern Europeans, to spread around the country, to spread them out. The argument being that Jews are the most obvious example. Eastern European Jews clustered on the Lower East Side in New York were in a country that was pretty anti-urban anyway. They were causing even more prejudice against themselves by causing all these urban problems, right? And if you could just spread them out, there wouldn't be so much of a problem. Well, two things. One, that's actually, the last version of this I should have included, has a picture of the Jewish cemetery that is next to this border wall that my great-grandfather co-founded, like extraordinarily weird, like why were there Jews in the middle of the Arizona desert? Distribution policy. Let's get out of the west side of Chicago and move where people want us because they want us to open stores. Okay, so personal interest. But secondly, you know what that says? That is not a racial argument against immigration, okay? It is a cultural argument. Now, it's not great. It's like, we don't like you, you should move away. But it is not, you are racially inferior and you can't come to our country. And that's a very big difference, okay? This is what I mean about you have to be historically minded. Neither's great, but one is much worse, okay? You know what I'm saying? And Jet Locke, who was the guy who organized all the immigrants and industry reports, he was a big proponent of distribution policy. Now, why do we not talk about it? Because it didn't work. Because I happen to know, because I was just doing research, 60 Jews ended up in this town of Douglas, Arizona. That was really not going to compete with the Lower East Side, you know what I'm saying? But it didn't work. And it's like one of those, winners write the history thing. We forgot about it. But the Dillingham Commission was quite serious about it. And what I mean to say is that this was a cultural compatibility argument. It was an argument that too many of them are ruining my town, but it's their culture, not their race, right? And I do think that that is a meaningful distinction. Okay, now that actually relates to the last point I wanted to make about a comparison to Germany. One of the things that is interesting about the United States, that it is even though we throw all kinds of federal power at immigration policy now and border walls, one vestige of our skepticism about federal power is that the United States, with a country with, trillions of debt, forget about what our budget is, spends in the millions on immigrant integration, basically USCIS spends like $2 million a year on federal grants to integrate immigrants, as opposed to, this is not a great day to talk about integration of immigrants in Germany, but historically the German state has put forward programs to integrate immigrants, right, into culture and economy. In the United States, and most receiving countries do that. The United States takes a very Tocquevillian approach to that and says voluntary associations should do that. So a good example of that is all the Americanization classes of the early 20th century were at places like churches and the YMCA, and even now, a lot of classes for literacy and immigrants are in churches in the United States. But the best example is that the Refugee Act actually named, I don't know how many it is, maybe a dozen agencies in the United States. They are private agencies, and most of them are religious, whose job it is to integrate refugees into the United States. So we don't really have a federal, they would call it Americanization, we might call inclusion or integration policy, which is, like I said, unique among receiving countries. Can I leave with you? That was a joke. Next question.
I'm Stefan Hirschauer. You allowed us to ask everything we
Yes.
want. So this is
I mean, I didn't say an answer everything,
What happens
but-
now? You said in the beginning the Dillingham Commission created immigration as a problem. The sociology of social problems would call this the problematization phase
Yes.
of a social problem. So,
Agreed.
and the Commission also defined at the same time what counts as a solution,
Yes.
namely to install a quotation system oriented at the distribution of ethnic categories in the census of 1890s.
Yes.
Now, yeah.
Yada, yada.
So this moment of time was used to define the ethnic composition of the country. Now, I want to invite you to a completely weird thought experiment, an anthropological thought
I'm into it.
experiment. I'm thinking, I'm imagining an immigration commission of Native American Indians 200 years earlier, in the 18th century. How would this fictitious commission have defined the correct composition of the population of North America?
Excuse me.
I apologize for this question. The reason why I'm interested in it is because I find it completely fascinating how partly involuntarily, partly voluntary by decision, the we changed during these centuries. The we's in the southern part of North America, which is now commonly called the United States. There's no answer to this question, but just...
No, well, let me understand it a little. You're saying that by let's say 1907, when the Dillingham Commission was created and made these findings, it had a sense of the United States we that included these sociological categories, right? And you're saying, where did that come from?
Yeah, they were fixed somehow.
I agree, they're not fixed.
What happened before was not fixed. There were flows happening. Yeah? Your story is...
A moment in time.
Yeah, that's it.
Yes. Well, first I would say, I assume you mean Native Americans like indigenous, like American Indians, right? So they would say, we're all each our own people, and they would have none of this. They would have their own conceptions, right, of categorizations. So I know that was a hypothetical, but they wouldn't think about this in the same way at all. But I think I understand you to be saying or asking me, am I saying that these categories that are from the moment of, let's call it 1911, then became sticky and lasted? Is that what you're saying?
I'm not suggesting a particular answer.
Oh.
It's just fantasies, just a thought experiment from an anthropological perspective. Yeah.
Well, you should ask Joel Perlman, who's coming at the end of them, because he did the census categories. No, I know. And you know, he and I, we talked together because our books are obviously very similar and came out the same year at Harvard. I'm going to think about it, though, because I know I'll see you again, and I'm going to think about what I think the legacy part is, because I know you're being fantastical, but it is an interesting question. To me, the question would be, which parts of their racial categorization stayed and which changed over time, and why were they what they were when they were? Does that, to me, that's how I would think about the question. So I'm going to keep thinking about it. Okay.
One of the problems with this, of course, would be that the Native American categorizations are the result of white intervention.
Right. Right.
So you have to figure out.
Well, that's like, for an example, the Navajo, their own word for themselves is the Dene, the people. They're the people. They are the ones. They are the people. But also, right, that now we're talking about Native American policy, but forced migration created new tribal groups that wouldn't have existed before, yet they were also highly migratory even before Europeans came. So that's a whole other topic. Okay. A question that I do think about, though, is that how this looks different from, say, Mexico, which, okay, so now, actually, may I say something about this? Because this is interesting, because last week, when the new president of Mexico was elected, and there was a lot of discussion, first woman, and also that she's Jewish. Well, my synagogue, okay, not... The old men in the synagogue had quite a discussion on the listserv about whether she should count as Jewish or not, because she doesn't call herself Jewish. I mean, I was like, guys. But anyway, I tried to intervene with expertise, but it was not welcomed. But anyway, but I will bring it up here where I hope expertise is more welcomed. That is actually an interesting comparison, because secularism in Mexico is very different than secularism in the United States. It is, I said, well, if we're going to have that conversation, we should talk about how mind-blowing it is that an atheist got elected. I was like, there's going to be a Jew and a woman elected to president before there's going to be an atheist president, right? Like, so I was trying to explain that the context of racial and religious categories is so different in the Mexican racial and political system that it's really irrelevant for us to say whether or not she would call herself Jewish or whether we should, because the context is totally different. So there's also a comparative question there.
Is the atheist now?
She is, Claudia, yeah. Well, her point was that she wouldn't call herself Jewish because I think she I don't want to read into it, but my guess, based on what I know about Mexican politics and racial categories, is that she perceives that to be a religious category, and she was raised by leftist atheists, and she doesn't want to take on that. Whereas in the United States, it doesn't exactly work like that, so it's a kind of apples and oranges, if you follow me. Yeah.
There's a great part in your book, actually.
Thank you. Just stop there. We're done.
But where that debate is taking place, in the sense that sort of Jewish identity in many ways was defined in the context of the Dillingham Commission in very different ways. And one issue was exactly the question, the debate that Henry Cabot Lodge, the senator, sort of anti-Semitic senator, had with Simon Wolf, one of the representatives of the reformist Jewish tradition, where Lodge essentially questioned Wolf, asked him, because Wolf insisted that Jews would be a religious identity, not a race.
Yes, because he was very
And
reform.
Lodge said, well, what happens to Jews who are no longer Jewish?
And he used Israeli as an example.
He used Disraeli as the example. And then Wolf, of course, got in trouble because he wanted to claim Disraeli
Correct.
as
The
a
problem
Jew,
is
even
that-
though he was a secularized Jew.
Right.
But he wouldn't necessarily agree to the idea that if a Jew left the Jewish religion, he or she would no longer be Jewish. So that was that.
Right, and the context in
Mexico.
Mexico is very different, in part because secularism works really different in their political system than it does in the U.S. So I'm saying, like, it would be fun, like, that's actually a pretty good comparison because Mexico is redefining its racial categories at around the same time. Yeah.
Just a thought on Shanghai. Don't you think it could be more acceptable also for the Mexican population, or more electable
Which
to
part?
be atheist than Jewish, because it's such a Catholic?
Well, now we're really getting off
yeah,
topic.
but it's a very Catholic. It's deeply
I
Catholic
don't know
society.
about that. I don't want to answer that because I'm not an expert. I mean, I knew enough to try to correct these dudes on the listserv, but it didn't work. But
And they could have a political
maybe,
reasons
maybe
for it.
not, because I'll use the example. In the United States, freedom of religion, as you know, is a central tenet, but it is really freedom to have religion. Atheism is still viewed with great disdain. Mexico, as Catholic as it is actually a little bit more like France, where there is a civil religion of no religion. It is definitely not as much as France because Catholicism is much more woven into popular culture, but it is more acceptable to have freedom from religion in Mexico, weirdly enough, than it is in the United States, I think, in the political system. So, but it's a hypothetical question because we don't know how to test it, right? Like we don't have I don't know.
Can I just ask you a couple
Yeah.
of things? One is, I wanted to take you back to this issue of health-based.
Yeah, I'm going to sit here now.
You mentioned
Yeah.
that in Ellis Island in particular, it was not a particularly important category or exclusion.
It was important, but it didn't
for a very
exclude.
small
It didn't.
percentage.
Yeah, it didn't exclude very
But-
many
but
people.
Again, going back to your book and also to the other coast, if you go to
Yes.
Angel Island,
Yeah,
so there is an ethnicization of
disease.
sort of health-based exclusions.
Agreed.
And again, going back to the Jewish case too.
Yes,
where there's
who
a
were
number of-
often
of-
excluded
of-
for a
of,
likely to
rank and
become
file,
yes.
immigration officials excluding Jews because they had been particularly malnourished during the
Okay, no,
trip
they
and
were
so on.
excluding them because they were Jewish, but they used
But
the
they
health
used the health, that's
restrictions.
what I mean.
That's
that
correct.
They used the
Yes,
health.
that is
So I
correct.
was wondering if you could talk a little bit
Yes.
more about the sort of the machinations really and the applications of the health-based exclusion.
Okay, that's a good point. So,
and the other question
yeah.
I was going to ask is, you mentioned in your list one, which is one result of the Dillingham, which was of particular interest to the idea of categories of human differentiation, which became a great important basis
Right.
for differentiating sort of races, peoples, and so on. And that's the dictionary of races and peoples.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
When I'm in the States, I go and get the physical copy of the Dictionary of Races or Peoples out of the library because it is a doozy. Okay. First question was about health restrictions used as a weapon of exclusion.
Yeah.
That did happen. And I know that some of what you're citing is in my chapter on Jews. One of the things that Jewish lobbyists complained about, I say complain in a positive, I mean that they took exception to, was they did find out about individual inspectors who would exclude Jews and say they're malnourished and they're not strong enough to support themselves on their own. And Jewish lobbyists went to the federal government and the Secretary of Commerce and Labor, which at that time the Bureau of Immigration was under them, and said, hey, look, this is not a permanent condition. They're malnourished because of bad food on the steamships, and or they keep kosher and they couldn't get access to kosher food. You shouldn't exclude them on the basis of that because it's not a permanent condition. And in many cases, they were able to reverse it. So to me, this is a story. It is true that you could use health inspections in a discriminatory way, just like you could use the likely to become a public charge in discriminatory ways. That absolutely happened. But if you look at the numbers, it's not that many people, right? Right. Okay, but but on the Asian side, they're already facing a raft of exclusions, right? That's already with a, but I completely agree with your point that, and you know, there's been a lot of work on this, that disease was associated with certain populations and especially Asians, and Nayan Shah's work is really important on this point, including, of course, like moral hygiene and also brown immigrants being targeted for vice laws and things like that. That's definitely the case. What was this? Oh, the second thing was about the Dictionary of Races or Peoples. So one of the reports, one of the 41 volumes of the commission was something called the Dictionary of Races or Peoples. It was written by a guy named Folkmar, who was an anthropologist. He had previously been in the Philippines, which was like the laboratory for racist anthropology for Americans. And he had created the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair exposition on the Philippines. His wife was a medical doctor, Elnora Folkmar. She co-wrote that volume with him, or co-coordinated it. The idea behind the Dictionary of Races or Peoples was originally it was meant to be an internal manual for the 300 agents of the, or 100 agents, whatever, for the commission to help them understand racial people categories in the United States. It took them too long. Everything takes too long, right? And they didn't get it done till almost the end, so it wasn't that much use internally. But it is the document that you can turn to and say, these people were crazy eugenicists. Well, two things, yes, but also it didn't get done in time for the reports to use it. And two, it was kind of a mashup of things. It was using this really racist, silly taxonomy of this Philadelphian ethnologist, Brinton? I can't believe I came up with that name. And then some other stuff. You know, it was just like really bad early 20th century social science. And if I read the categories to you, you would laugh. The Mexican one I always read to my students, going back to racial categories in Mexico. The Mexican one basically says that anyone with Indian blood is not Mexican, so only basically people with pure Spanish blood are Mexican, which in a country called Mexico, and if you're from there, is Mexican, meant that like 10% of Mexico could be called Mexican. It was like nonsensical on its face. But what I think is interesting is that I'm actually gonna link the two parts of your question together. Elnora Folkmar, his wife, who was a medical doctor and co-created the volume, she was the eugenicist in the family. She was a medical doctor. She actually became like a big social hygiene expert and gave eugenics talks after that as a doctor. So she actually brought he was an anthropologist with all that crazy racial science of the early 20th century, but she was the science scientist, and so that was one of the more eugenics-oriented volumes, for sure. It also, feedback loop, was lots and lots of racial science from Europe that was clapping back, right? So the Northern Europe, Southern Europe stuff was all Lombardo? Vince Lombardi's the NFL coach of the Green Bay Packers, not that. Lombardo, the Jewish Italian anthropologist who created the taxonomy of Northern and Southern Italian. So that book was like, we want to exclude Europeans, but let's use some European racial science to make our argument. You know, it was a mashup. It is a fascinating volume, though. I have my students in my immigration class like look up their ethnic origins in there, and there's a lot of howling with laughter. Yeah. More? No more? Okay.
Yeah, yes, I know. That's, I was gonna
Okay,
wrap things up.
good.
But thank you so much. Thank you very much again for your talk.
Thank you. Thank you.